Hi, I'm TheHande here. So, how many different kinds of media players do you use these days? Now, because so many things are streamed these days, people usually don't have a lot of use for these unless you produce your own videos like I do. So you might use Windows Media Player or that built-in player in Windows 10. And if all else fails, maybe VLC. So I would argue that probably for 95% of all your independent media usage, you probably use just one player. But back in the early 2000s, it was not uncommon for there to be at the very least 3 different media players. Plus, if you were the curious sort like I was, you were probably also using a bunch of different other players for very specific media files. So why did we need so many different media players back in the day? Well, obviously different media files don't come out of nowhere. Someone has to create them, and in a lot of cases, certain media files are actually owned by companies. And the only way to play back that media was to use that company's specific players. However, over time, as certain media types become so commonplace that, for instance, video editors or other types of software require compatibility with those formats in order for them to be useful, lots of media files have become genericized, which is the process of becoming generic enough that other companies and even independent software developers will use them. So even if you weren't using as many different types of media formats, the 3 media players that you usually probably had on pretty much any computer back in the day was, of course, the classic media player for Windows, WinAmp, and QuickTime. So let's begin with QuickTime. It is a fair assessment, in my opinion, that if you had a computer in the late 90s and if you owned any video game or any of the tons of educational multimedia CD-ROMs that came out at around that time, you probably had QuickTime on your computer. Why was that? Well, because of .mov. .mov, as well as QuickTime, is of course owned by Apple, and in the mid-90s, .mov was pretty much the most advanced video file format that existed. Note that there were a ton of different competing video formats around that time. MOV, however, became so popular because of its relatively high quality of both video playback and audio, as well as its ability to also integrate into other media formats. This is why .mov was so popular with those multimedia CD-ROMs. Many of them wanted to include grainy educational videos, and although some video games also probably used .mov, a lot of companies did, however, use their own specialized video formats as well. And before YouTube was really a thing, .mov was also very popular for embedding videos onto websites and things. Now, the 90s was not a good time for Apple overall, but QuickTime was probably their single most commercially successful product because Apple just kept licensing it to all these different software companies with reckless abandon, which is why pretty much any piece of software that you bought during the 90s probably came with a free copy of QuickTime on it, the same way most PC games probably came with the latest version of DirectX. It wasn't until the early 2000s when .mov started to have so many high-quality competitors, I mean Microsoft developed their own. At some point, Apple just stopped governing the commercial rights of .mov, and so other software developers and media players began to support it as well. Alright, but what about WinAmp?
WinAmp. It really whips the llama's ass.
Now, even though these days Windows Media Player can basically play any video format under the sun, during the Windows 98 era, Media Player for Windows honestly kinda sucked. It couldn't even play CDs. CDs, by the way, if you've never heard of them, were these optical media that used to be very popular for distributing music before streaming services became a thing. Most computers had their own integrated CD playing software that was separate from Media Player. And before copy protection for CDs was really commonplace, it wasn't necessarily very difficult to extract music from CDs. It wasn't necessarily very practical to keep that music stored on your hard drive. This is because CDs use uncompressed WAV files, or WAV files, which tend to be very big. A file format called MP3 came into existence, and this was pretty much a godsend for music aficionados who wanted the convenience of listening to their favorite music, but without having to put the CD in every time. Now, of course, WAV files can be compressed, but doing so necessarily affects the quality of the audio to such a degree that eventually the audio will be very grainy and most likely in mono. MP3 was very exciting from the point of view that it could compress an audio file to almost a hundredth of its original size, but would maintain more or less the same fidelity and audio quality as the original audio track. But during the Windows 98 period, you could not listen to MP3s on Media Player, which is why independently produced players like WinAmp were all the rage. WinAmp was generally kind of the media player that music fans used back in the day because it had one feature that media player was still lacking at this point, which was the ability to create playlists. Most media players back then didn't allow you to create playlists of any kind. Now, MP3s are so ubiquitous, you might even wonder why the Windows Media Player originally didn't support it, and that might have been that MP3 at its inception had a rather insidious reputation due to its association with websites like Napster. If you've never heard of Napster, it was basically a website where people shared MP3s of their favorite artists' music, and as a result, Napster became the subject of the first gigantic internet-related lawsuit, as several musical artists sued Napster for copyright infringement. Now, of course, the internet being the internet, the death of Napster didn't obviously stop people from sharing MP3s with each other. But because of Napster, for a couple of years, MP3s kind of had this shady reputation as that illegal music format. But of course, things would turn around for MP3 as a file format very quickly once companies started to realize that there was actually money to be made off of it. The incredible sound compression capabilities of MP3 was very soon discovered by game developers, because it allowed for a much bigger variety of sound effects and musical tracks to be included in games, because before this, game devs also had to use WAV files, but often had to bit crunch them quite a bit if they wanted to include a lot of them. Which is why the audio quality of late 90s PC games was kind of all over the map. And of course, the emergence of portable MP3 players was another big factor for why MP3s eventually became accepted in wider society. Another good example of this would be the Grand Theft Auto games. In the PC version of GTA 3, there was a feature called User Track Radio, where people could dump WAV files of their favorite music and just listen to them while playing the game. By the time of GTA San Andreas, User Track Radio had evolved into just being the MP3 player channel. So here's my short, rambly little history into these different media players. Tell me, are there any specialized media players that you still use to this day? Do you, for instance, still use WinAmp? Other obscure media player that most people have never heard of? Drop it in the comments below. I'm TheHande, and see you on the next one.